Hey, welcome back to another video. This video is going to be on multi-step forms with Livewire, something that was requested by someone else in a previous comment section. And I found the idea pretty interesting. I just haven't had the time to put the project together, but this is what I came up with now. I have this demo project here that I would consider the final version of what I want to build in this video. And basically it's just a page in the Breeze dashboard on a relatively fresh Laravel project. And you enter your first name, last name, email address. So for me, it would be like this. And the validation should fail on each field. So if I reuse the email that I'm currently logged in with, it should throw an error, or it should show an error rather. And now it should let me get to the next page. Here I'll enter a password. If the passwords don't match, it will give me an error. If I make them match, it will clear the error and allow me to submit, and that user should now exist in the database. Here is a fresh database of the starter project. This is what the project looks like now, and we're gonna take this and transform it into what you see in the final version. I've already logged in with an account I created. You can see it in the database here, test.test.com. And basically by the end of this video, we should be able to create new users with the full validation thing working, all of it done. Let me show you the starting project here. So what I've done is I've created a new Laravel project. I'm running PHP 8. I have everything set up with Valet on a separate development domain. I've installed Livewire, I've installed Breeze, and I've already created the component with the Tailwind and HTML stuff just to save some time. If you're interested in Tailwind related stuff, I have plenty of videos before this that you could watch, and you'll probably find value there. I don't want to spend too much time on Tailwind in this video because it's just gonna get way too big and I'm gonna lose my place and it probably won't bring you that much value. So let's just start with the web file. I've created a new route here with it's /user/create. It goes to the create user form component and it uses the auth middleware. It has a users.createName. In here the component is empty, but in the template I've already set up all the HTML that you saw in the starter application here. So all of this is what you're seeing in the file. And we're going to make that work. I've also edited the app.blade.php. So as you can see, I've added the Livewire styles, Livewire scripts here. This is something you have to do when you're installing Livewire. With Breeze, I believe, there is an app.blade.php that Livewire expects to be there, and you have to add that in there. What's interesting about the Breeze dashboard is that it expects a header, right? So the header you see here is the header here. And so inside the template file, I've also used an X slot with the name header to just add that in there. And that's what you're seeing there. So this is the starting point. I think the first part that we need to do is just make the correct form fields show up in the correct pages, so to speak, and make those buttons work. Once we have the different buttons working, we could flip between pages of the form. We could then make the actual submission work, then work on the errors, the success message, and along the way get all the heading and subheadings working. So let's get started. Step for me is going to be just declaring a couple public properties in here that we can use in our template. So public current page, and I'm going to set this to default to 1. And I'm also going to create a public pages. And here we're going to track the heading and subheadings that you see in the starter here. So heading, subheading, these should change based on the page we're on within the template. Okay, and in here, the first page should be personal information because it's just name and email. And I'm going to call page 2 just password. And the subheading should be enter your name and email to get started. And down here, let's make it create a password for the new account. That should work. The added benefit of having pages declared like this is that we could actually just use count pages to get the total number of pages, which we're going to use for the submit button in a second. I'm also going to create a couple public functions here. First one's going to be go to next page, and I'm going to use this to increment current page. There's a little bit of setup involved here. I know it may not make sense now, but as we go through the template, it'll start making more sense. So go to previous page, and we're going to do the same thing, just decrement. So current page minus minus, and that should be fine. on the component side. Let's go ahead and start implementing that here. First thing I'm going to do is use the current page to get the correct heading. So how I'm going to do this is actually just use pages, which is now available in our template. Current page, heading, and down here we're going to use similar thing, pages, current page, subheading. And now if I refresh the page here, we're going to get an error because we're not using a $sign. So if I refresh now, personal information, enter your name and email to get started. Perfect, because we're on the first page. So now let's go ahead and make sure that our correct fields are showing. I'm going to zoom one way just to get a better view here. We have one containing div here containing the name, first name, last name, email address, and then another one containing the password and confirmation. This should be page 1, this should be page 2. We're just going to use an if here to make sure that we're showing the correct one. So if current page is 1, else if current page is equal to 2, and down here we could just use an end if. I'm going to indent these just to keep it clean in the template file. We can refresh and see that only the first name, last name, and email address are showing, which means that the password and confirmed password are actually being hidden, and so that works for now. Now, it'd be nice to actually be able to click these buttons and go to the correct page. The interesting thing here is that you see 3 buttons and there's going to be an empty div here. We should only see either 2 buttons or 1 button and an empty div based on the page. If we're on the first page, we should only see the next button. That's it. If we're on the last page, we should see back button and submit. If we're on some page in the middle, like page 2 out of 3, we should see back and next. I hope that makes sense. So we're going to implement that now. Let's go ahead and just go to our button section here. So as you can see, I'm using flex, item center, justify between. If you're not familiar with Tailwind, what this means is flex is obviously flex, using flexbox. Item center will align it vertically. Justify between will push 2 elements, or however many elements there are, as far away from each other horizontally as it can. So if you have 2 elements and justify between, it will push those 2 elements to opposite ends of the containing div. In our case, if I have an empty div and a next button, they will be opposite of each other. But if I have no empty div here and there's only a next button like on the first page, then the next button will probably be at the left side of the box, the containing div, which doesn't make much sense. So that's why that empty div is there. Let's go ahead and get this implemented and it'll probably make more sense. The first thing I'm going to do is actually check if the current page is equal to 1, because we want that that empty div to be visible there. And here I'm going to do @else, because if it's not page 1, then we should have a back button. End div, end if, and let's indent these. Here we're going to want to check if we're on the last page, and that's where that public property pages will come in, because we could actually count how many pages there are and then check against which page we're on, and that's how we're going to know if we're on the last page. So @if current page is equal to count of pages. If it's not, else, else, end if. Let's indent these, make sure it looks good. Refresh the page here and see what happens. So we have an empty div here, you can't see it. That's why the next is aligned here. Actually, I could probably just remove this temporarily. You could see that without that empty div, the next is on this side, which doesn't make much sense. Now I could have dynamically set justify between to only be added if we're not on the first page. I'm not a fan of that in using like the blade helpers, because it just looks ugly, it's not view. And so I just prefer doing it this way. So if I click next here, it should take us to the password, but it doesn't, because we haven't implemented the wire click yet. If I click the back button, we should wire click to go to previous page. That public method we defined earlier, go to previous page, will just decrement the current page. If I do the opposite and click next, we should go to next page. Now if I refresh and click next, you can see we go to the next page, our password and confirmed password fields are showing, all the other ones are hidden, and our headings have changed. So it's password, create a password for the new account, So far, so good. Of course, our submit button doesn't work yet. Well, it's submitting the form in the most basic way HTML knows how to, but there's nothing really defined on how to submit data where to put it. You can see that it's just trying to add it to the URL here. So what we're going to do now is implement that basic submit button without any validation and see how far we can get there. The first thing I want to do is actually define wire model on all of our text inputs here. So you can see first name, last name, email address, password, and password confirmation, but they're not actually linked to any public properties in here. So let's define those and then link them in the template. So public first name, public last name, public email, public password, public confirm password. So we also want to confirm password because we're going to be validating and this will come in handy. And now we could actually go ahead and just link these in here. So wire model.lazy is equal to first name. The reason I use .lazy is because when it comes time to implement validation, I don't want the validator to be running on every keystroke, every time you type a letter. It's just not necessary. So .lazy will only run the validator when you've clicked away from the element. Next, we can do wire model.lazy equal to last name. Oops. Wire model.lazy is equal to email. And down here, we could do the same thing. Let me just copy this. Password and confirm password. So let's make sure that these are the same and they're spelled correctly, and they are. And now we have these available with the data for our submit method, which doesn't exist yet. So we can create one now. Let's create a submit method. And in here, we can create a user, which we need to import, create, and we need a name, which I'll fill in a second. We need an email, which would be this email. And we need a password, which would be this password. Now keep in mind, nothing's being validated. This is not great, but we will implement a validator. And the reason I wanted to fill this in last is because the database uses one name column, but we actually take a first and last name input separately. The way I'm going to get around this is just by just concatenating them together. So first name, this, last name, and now this will be fine. So if we go back to our form now, refresh, and let's just try it. So David, and do test. Let's see what's already in the database. So we got test@test.com. If I do test@test.com, test2@test.com, next, and just make it password and password and hit submit, still won't work because we haven't actually defined where to submit to in our template. And so up here in the form, we can do wire submit.prevent to prevent any kind of weird refreshing stuff, and just specify that we want to use the submit method. Something to note, we have a type submit button down here for the submit button, and you're gonna want to make sure you have type button on any button within a form element, because our form element closes here. You're gonna want to use type button on it, because if you don't, I've had instances where buttons that were not meant to be submit buttons were treated as submit buttons. So I always kind of use type button to make sure that doesn't happen. Now if we go to the form, refresh without this stuff, try again, test2@test.com, next, password, submit, nothing happens. But if we go to our database, I think it'll be in there, and it is. So we could also kind of make this nicer by resetting our fields. And the way I want to do this is by just calling the Livewire helper reset. And this will reset our fields to whatever they were originally, I believe. So if I refresh now, just do test3@test.com. next, password, and submit. We can see that it takes us back to the original page and the first page, and also resets our fields here. And I believe, if we're lucky, yes, we have test3@test.com in here, which means that it actually worked. Now, of course, we forgot one thing. We have to hash our passwords because you don't want to store them in plain text. So I forgot to just wrap this in bcrypt. And that should solve our problem with that. I will actually delete these two records, and that should solve that. So the next step will actually be implementing validation. As you can see, it's kind of annoying that we have both of these showing. That's not how it should be. And also, if there are errors on page 1 or any page before the submit page, the last page, we shouldn't be able to click next. That just doesn't make sense. So that's what we're going to do next. Okay, so this might get a little tricky because we need to keep track of validation rules based on the page we're on. And so we're going to have to define rules a little bit differently than we would normally. And before I do that, I just want to go through and actually make sure that our stuff is set up correctly so that these error alerts don't come up when there are no errors. So what I'm going to do is actually just wrap this in an errors. If errors is not empty, and if, oops, I forgot the at. And I'm going to indent this. And down here, I'm actually just going to go ahead and do the same for the success one because we just need it out of the way so it's easier to see what's happening. Now you'll notice that the success public property has not been set, but I will set that in 1 second. So success, end if. I'm going to indent this. And in here, let's just declare a success. So public success. And we could actually already set this down here. So this success is equal to user created successfully. And of course, once we have validation implemented, we can assume that if the execution actually gets down to this line, then it would have been submitted successfully regardless because validation will happen before the user's created anyways. So let's refresh and see if that changes anything. Okay, so those are both gone. Now we need to take care of these guys. And what we're going to do is actually, I've already included the spans here for errors. And so we just need to wrap them in the @error stuff. And in our case, we could just do @error. And in this case, the key would be first name. I believe in here, this would be message. So we can replace these all at once. Just to make our lives easier. And we could go to the end of the span and do end error. And then I'll just go ahead and manually add these everywhere with the correct naming. And now we should be able to only see these error messages if there are actual error messages for these keys within the error bag. I can go ahead and actually declare my error validation rules. And like I said, I'm going to do this a little bit differently than you normally would with Livewire. I'm going to make this private. And I could have squeezed the error validation rules in here if I wanted to track by page, but there's no reason to make the actual validation rules available within the page. When you're using Livewire's built-in protected rules array that you can use or declare within your component, it is protected for a reason, I think. So for me, just declaring it private to keep within the component class is fine. I don't want it to go to the template. I'm going to call it validation rules. That just kind of makes sense to me. And I'm also going to use the 1 and 2 keys for the pages. The only difference in here is I'm going to remove this and I'm going to remove this, and this is where our validation rules are going to live. So first name, let's make this required and a minimum of 3 characters long. This may not make sense in the real world, but let's just do this so it's easy to show that the validation actually works. Last name will be the same. And email will be also required email. And it has to be unique on the users and the email column. Okay, I hope that's making sense. Now for the second page, because the second page has a password and confirm password, I'm going to make it password and then confirm password. And both of these are also going to be required, so I could just copy and paste these in. And we're going to make these string minimum of 8. And this one's going to also be a string. It has to be the same as the password field above it. And it also has to be a minimum of 8. That just makes sense. So these are my validation rules. Now it is grayed out in my VS Code because it's not used yet, but I can now use it in here. The only trouble is if I use the built-in validator from Livewire, it's going to expect an array of just keys instead of an array of pages with the keys within it. So I found a way to get around this, and I can actually demo this in here. So within Tinkerwell, what I've done is I've actually copied in the validation rules here. And as you can see, it automatically just kind of runs it, and it's giving me the same thing back here. Now, if I want to just grab one specific page's rules, I could just use it like an array with the key. If I want to get all rules like I need to for the this arrow validate, what I need to do is just collect them. And I'm going to do this by hand just to show you what's happening. So if I collect this, it'll just wrap the same thing in a collection. I need to collapse it, which will remove those first keys, exactly what we need. But this won't work either because what's happening in the this validate, which I can show you, right? If I click into this, you can see that it's actually going to expect an array. And so what I'm going to do is just in Tinkerwell, I can just call toArray. And this is exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for the keys with the validations, and this is available for all pages at once, because on the submit button, we definitely want to validate every field, not just the ones on the last page. I hope that makes sense. So let me remove this and let's actually implement this. So this arrow validate, and let's call just rules, and we're going to get rules here. So rules, again, let's collect them. So this validation rules, collapse to array. Maybe there's a better way to do this, but this actually worked for me. And so now we're validating based on these rules. And now technically, if we go and we try to submit, if I refresh the page and I try to do this, next, and submit, these are required. These match and they will pass, but it won't allow me to submit, and yet there still are errors. By the way, our alert works, which is great. There still are errors, but it won't return me to the page with the errors. This is kind of a difficult thing to figure out. What I ended up doing was implementing validation on every next click. If you get from one page to the next, that means the previous page validated completely. And so I'll never have the situation where there's something failing on page 1 or 2, despite everything passing validation on page 3. So at least we know that the validation works. If I remove this and make it something that doesn't match and click submit, we're going to see that the confirm password and password must match. Our validation is working. Now, I'm also going to include this. If we submit successfully and a record is created, we're also going to reset validation. This is also something that is included with Livewire and is super helpful. And I'm just going to include that now before we forget. So the way I implement that per page validation is basically by calling the validator on the go to next page method. So this validate. And it's going to be the same thing as last time, except if we go back to Tinkerwell here, I'm only going to use a key to get the ones I need. So I'm going to use the current page to get the exact ones I need. And within here, we can do it this way. This validation rules current page. And so now if I refresh and go here, test, 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 that's not a valid email. If I click, you can see the email must be a valid email address. And now I will never be able to get to the next page and actually submit the form if these values do not pass validation. And so what if we want to implement that the validation when we click out of an element and try to click into another one? We want to do that automatically. Well, that's also something that's built into Livewire, and it's something that I think is pretty cool. What we can do is actually just create a function here, a public function, and we can call it updated. And updated receives a property name. And we could use that property name to validate only that property. And so what we're going to do is we're going to call this validate only, and typically you would just pass in property name, and you'd be done with it. Because typically you'd have a protected rules array here with the validation on the same level already collapsed, and Livewire would be smart enough to kind of already figure out what to validate against this property name. And so in our case, what we want to do is if we actually click into this method here, we can pass in a field, which is a property name, and it defaults to null rules because it'll actually go ahead and figure out the rules, messages, and attributes by itself somewhere in here. And so we can go ahead and just figure out the rules from our validation rules array here. And I'm going to pass in property name, and then I'm also going to pass in this validation rules, this current page. And this will actually end up working exactly as it would had we used the typical Livewire way of doing stuff. And what will happen is if we're on page 1 and we're validating email, it will go ahead and get only validation rules for page 1. And then Livewire will look into this array and say, okay, property name is email, so we need to validate email. We're going to use this. And that's what's going to happen there. This is actually updated. And now if I refresh and type in one letter here, because the minimum is 3, and I click into last name, you can see that the first name must be at least 3 characters. I can do the same thing there, and I can also put in a random string there, and you can see that it says the email must be a valid email address. It will not let me submit because it will fail validation. So that's fine. We've accomplished pretty much everything. The last piece of this puzzle is to figure out the just the success message alert if we submit a successful one. So let's try that. Next, put in a password that matches. By the way, we are validating everything here, so test should throw an error. It does. Submit, and if we submit, we can see that we have in the database that record with the hashed password. And we have this user created successfully message, but we can't remove it. So this is kind of like the last little thing to implement, and we can do this very easily just by creating a method called function reset success. We could call this reset and then pass in success specifically, which is something that this method from Livewire allows you to do. You can just pass in the success key and it will reset only this. And now within our template, we can find our success alert, which would be, I believe, right here. And I think this is the actual button. So we can just do wire click reset success. So now let's create a real user and make sure we can log in with them. So let's do my name again, realuser.com. Copy this. Password. Submit this. We can now clear this message, refresh, message doesn't come up again. We can log out, log in using that email, password. We can log in so the password is hashed correctly. Everything works, and that is the completed multi-step form with Livewire tutorial. I hope you enjoyed this video. A couple notes before I end this. I don't know if Livewire is the best tool for this job. I feel like managing pages within a PHP class is probably not the way to go. I work with Inertia and Vue at work, and that seems way better suited for this use case. So if you are thinking of building something like this, I would definitely reach for JavaScript and just use Laravel as your backend. Just seems way more. It seems to make more sense to manage pages in this kind of managing state within JavaScript than it does with PHP. Just something to note. I hope you enjoyed this video. I just recently crossed 1,000 subscribers, so to anyone subscribed, thank you. To anyone not subscribed, please do consider subscribing. I enjoy making these videos and will continue to do so. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.